In the last few hours, a man convicted of killing two Christian music producers in Garland nearly 2 decades ago was put to death.
In 2008, two men rode a train into a Dallas suburb looking for someone to rob. They had no target in mind, no real plan, just an idea that this particular neighborhood had money. Within a few hours, two young music producers were dead in a parking lot. The men responsible walked away with $2 and a stolen car. One of those men would spend the next 17 years on death row. In the days after his arrest, he gave interviews where he openly admitted to the shooting and showed no remorse at all, statements that would follow him all the way to his execution. Then, weeks before that execution, everything he'd said for nearly 2 decades got called into question by the one person who was there with him that night. His cousin signed a sworn statement claiming he was the actual shooter, not Broadnax. He said Broadnax only confessed to protect him, and Broadnax's lawyers said DNA evidence backed that claim up. Texas executed him anyway. This case raises a question true crime rarely gets to ask this directly. What happens when a confession, once given, becomes almost impossible to take back, even when new evidence suggests it might have been wrong? Before we go further, this video covers real violence and an execution, so please take care while watching. Welcome back to the Crime Vault. If you're new here, subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. And to everyone who's been sharing, commenting, and helping this channel grow, thank you. Genuinely, it makes a real difference. Now, let's get into what actually happened. On June 19th, 2008, James Broadnax and his cousin Demarius Cummings, both 19 years old, boarded public transportation in southeast Dallas and headed toward Garland, a suburb they'd never really spent time in. They weren't going there for any specific reason. They were looking for someone to rob, and later, Broadnax would tell reporters exactly why they picked that area. He said they went there because they believed, in his words, that the white rich people lived there. That statement wasn't just something he said casually, it was later used directly against him in court. Around 1 a.m., after wandering the area for a while, they came across two men outside a recording studio, Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler. Instead of approaching them with hostility, Broadnax and Cummings struck up a conversation. For close to half an hour, they talked with Swan and Butler about music, about the industry, about nothing in particular. Then they walked away. At that point, nothing had happened. But according to prosecutors, the two cousins had already marked Swan and Butler as potential targets during that conversation. They just hadn't acted on it yet. The reason they came back wasn't part of any plan, it was circumstance. When they tried to head back to Dallas, they realized public transit had already stopped running for the night. With no way home and no money, they returned to the studio, this time intending to follow through on the robbery. Swan and Butler were still there. What followed happened quickly. Both men were shot. Both died at the scene from their injuries. Afterward, Broadnax and Cummings searched the men's pockets. In total, they walked away with $2 in cash. The only thing of real value they took was Swan's car, a tan Ford Crown Victoria, which they used to leave the area. Two men were dead. The motive was robbery. The result was $2 and a stolen vehicle. It's hard to overstate how little this crime was actually about. There was no long-standing conflict, no personal history between the men involved. Swan and Butler were simply in the wrong parking lot, at the wrong time, with two young men who had already decided someone was going to get robbed that night. What happened next, how police eventually caught up with them, and how the case went to trial, is where this story gets more complicated than it first appears. Before we go further into the investigation, it's worth taking a moment to talk about who Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler actually were, because in a lot of coverage of this case, they tend to become footnotes to the legal drama that followed. They deserve more than that. Matthew Butler was 28 years old. He owned Zion Gate Records, a recording studio in downtown Garland that catered specifically to Christian artists. He'd built the space himself, with the goal of giving up-and-coming musicians in the Christian music scene a place to record and develop their sound. He was also a father of two. Stephen Swan was 26. He worked for Butler at the studio as a producer and engineer, not simply a business partner or friend, but someone Butler had brought on to help run day-to-day operations and production work. Swan lived in nearby Carrollton, and by most accounts was well regarded in the small, tight-knit Christian music community they were both part of. The two of them weren't just colleagues, they were, by the accounts of people who knew them, close to the kind of working relationship built on mutual trust, which is part of why they were so willing to strike up a friendly conversation with two strangers outside their own studio that night. There was no reason in that moment to expect anything was wrong. What makes this case particularly hard to sit with is how disconnected the violence was from anything Swan or Butler had done. They weren't targeted because of who they were specifically. They were targeted because two young men needed money and happened to cross paths with them at exactly the wrong time. Butler's mother, Teresa Butler, would go on to become one of the more vocal, consistent voices connected to this case in the years that followed. Someone who stayed present through the trial, through nearly 2 decades of appeals, and ultimately through the execution itself. We'll hear more from her later. For now, it's enough to understand this. Two working musicians, one of them a father, lost their lives that night to a decision made by two strangers in less time than it takes to explain it. Word travels fast, even among people who think they've gotten away with something. That same night, after the shooting, Broadnax and Cummings went to a relative's house where they changed out of the clothes they'd been wearing. From there, they made their way toward Texarkana, roughly 150 miles from Garland, still driving Swan's stolen Crown Victoria. They didn't stay hidden for long. According to reports, an acquaintance who'd seen news coverage of the killings recognized details connected to the case and reported them to police. Officers located the vehicle during a traffic stop in Texarkana, and both cousins were taken into custody that same night. From an investigative standpoint, this wasn't a case that required years of forensic work to crack. The stolen vehicle alone connected them directly to the scene. But what actually built the state's case, what turned this from a straightforward robbery homicide into something prosecutors could take confidently to trial, happened almost by accident, and largely because of the suspects themselves. In the days following his arrest, Broadnax gave multiple television interviews to local news stations. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. Reporters were granted access to interview a teenage murder suspect while he was reportedly still under the influence of drugs. And he spoke openly, on camera, without legal counsel present to advise him against it. In front of those cameras, he admitted in detail to being the shooter. He showed no visible remorse. When one reporter asked what he'd say to the victims' families, his response was blunt and dismissive. Those interviews became, in a very real sense, the foundation of the case against him. Prosecutors didn't need to rely solely on circumstantial evidence or witness testimony. They had a recorded on-camera admission, delivered without hesitation, days after two people had been killed. In many capital cases, building this level of certainty takes investigators months of forensic work, witness interviews, and evidence testing. Here, much of that groundwork was handed to prosecutors voluntarily by the suspect himself. There was also forensic evidence collected from the scene, including material recovered from the murder weapon and from one of the victim's pockets. At the time of the original investigation, this evidence supported the state's theory of the case, and there was little reason for investigators to look at it any differently. It wouldn't be until nearly 2 decades later that this same physical evidence would resurface, this time as a central piece of Broadnax's defense, rather than the prosecution's. We'll get to that. But at the time, in 2008, the case against James Broadnax looked about as straightforward as a capital murder case can look. There was a stolen car, a cooperative, if reckless confession, and physical evidence from the scene. Investigators and prosecutors had what they needed, and they moved toward trial with confidence. What they didn't fully account for was how much weight a 19-year-old's on-camera bravado would eventually carry both for and against him over the better part of the next 2 decades. James Broadnax's trial began in 2009 in Dallas County, and by most accounts, it moved quickly, largely because of how much evidence prosecutors already had before they even walked into the courtroom. Prosecutor David Alex laid out the state's case plainly for the jury. There was no long motive to untangle. no complicated web of relationships to explain. During closing arguments, Alex told jurors that Broadnax had, in his words, executed Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler for no other reason than they had something he didn't. It was a blunt characterization, and it stuck. Alex reminded the jury that this wasn't a complicated case built on inference or circumstantial links. It was a case built on the defendant's own recorded words. The defense, led by attorney Brad Lawler, didn't dispute that Broadnax was present or that a shooting had occurred. Instead, they focused on context. Specifically, the state Broadnax was reportedly in during both the crime and his television confessions. Lawler argued that Broadnax had smoked what's sometimes called a wet blunt marijuana, dipped in PCP, and, in some cases, embalming fluid, a combination known for causing disorientation and impaired judgment. The defense's argument wasn't that Broadnax hadn't done what he said on camera. It was that his own statements, made while intoxicated and in front of reporters days after a double homicide, shouldn't be treated as the coldly calculated confession prosecutors were presenting them as. Lawler went further, suggesting that without those television interviews, the state likely wouldn't have pursued the death penalty at all. It was an argument aimed less at innocence and more at proportionality, asking the jury to consider whether a reckless, drug-influenced series of interviews should carry as much weight as it clearly did in shaping how the public, and ultimately the jury, viewed Broadnax's character. The jury wasn't persuaded. On October 14, 2009, Broadnax was found guilty of capital murder in the deaths of both Swan and Butler. Years later, this trial would come under renewed scrutiny, not over the verdict itself, but over how the jury had been selected in the first place. Broadnax's legal team, in later appeals, alleged that prosecutors had struck all 7 prospective black jurors during selection, and pointed to a spreadsheet allegedly used during the process that highlighted names by race. It was a serious claim, one that, if substantiated, would have raised real questions about the fairness of the original trial and the makeup of the jury that ultimately decided his sentence. The state's response was direct. Prosecutors maintained that those jurors weren't struck because of race, but because of their answers during questioning, including, in some cases, stated opposition to the death penalty itself, which is a standard and legally permitted basis for exclusion in capital cases. The Texas Attorney General's office would later describe the racial bias claims as entirely without merit. Broadnax was sentenced to death. He was 20 years old. His cousin, Demarius Cummings, was tried separately 2 years later in 2011. The circumstances were different in one key way. Cummings had a prior criminal record, but he wasn't the one who had confessed on camera, and prosecutors didn't pursue the death penalty in his case. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life without parole, a sentence that would later become one of the most debated aspects of this entire case, once the question of who actually pulled the trigger resurfaced years down the line. At the time, though, the outcome felt settled. One man was sentenced to death, largely on the strength of his own words. One man was sentenced to life, largely because he hadn't said anything at all. That imbalance between one man's silence versus one man's confession is exactly what would come back into question nearly 17 years later. Nearly 2 decades would pass before that arrangement was seriously challenged. For nearly 17 years, James Broadnax lived on death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, one of the state's primary facilities for housing condemned inmates. By most accounts, including those from prison officials and fellow inmates, Broadnax changed significantly during that time. He turned to writing and poetry as an outlet. He was eventually selected for a faith-based rehabilitation program reserved for inmates who had demonstrated sustained discipline and a genuine record of change, not something granted easily or automatically. Within that program, he took on a mentorship role, teaching classes on conflict resolution and helping de-escalate tensions between other incarcerated individuals and prison staff. None of this erased what he'd been convicted of, but it did complicate the picture of who he was, nearly 2 decades removed from the reckless 19-year-old who'd given those television interviews. The young man who once showed no visible remorse in front of cameras was, by his final years, being described by people around him as thoughtful, disciplined, and deeply invested in helping others avoid the path that had led him to death row in the first place. On April 14, 2026, just 16 days before his scheduled execution, Broadnax married Tiana Kresnicki, a British law school graduate who had become one of his most consistent supporters in the years leading up to his death. The ceremony took place inside the Polunsky unit, with the couple separated by a glass partition, as is standard for these unions. It would be one of the last moments of normalcy before everything about his case changed. In March 2026, with Broadnax's execution date fast approaching, Demarius Cummings did something that would upend nearly 2 decades of legal consensus around this case. He submitted a sworn affidavit claiming that he, not Broadnax, had been the shooter that night in 2008. According to Cummings, the two of them had agreed, while both under the influence of PCP and marijuana, that Broadnax should take the blame. His reasoning, as he described it, was practical rather than emotional. Broadnax had little to no prior criminal record at the time, while Cummings already had a history of arrests. They believed, according to Cummings, that Broadnax would receive a lighter sentence as a result. Cummings said he came forward specifically after learning that Broadnax had been given a firm execution date, describing it as something he could no longer stay silent about, regardless of what it meant for his own case, given that he was already serving life without parole and had little to gain personally by speaking up. What gave this confession real legal weight wasn't just the affidavit itself. It was the physical evidence Broadnax's legal team pointed to alongside it. In court filings, his attorneys argued that DNA recovered from the murder weapon and from inside one victim's pocket matched Cummings, not Broadnax. If accurate, this was a significant detail. Physical evidence from the original crime scene that had never definitively placed the gun in Broadnax's hands to begin with, despite his own confession suggesting otherwise. This wasn't the only element of Broadnax's case getting renewed attention in his final months. His legal team also revived an argument from earlier appeals involving the way his own writing had been used against him at trial. Prosecutors had introduced lyrics Broadnax had written, describing them in court as gangster rap, as evidence supporting the argument that he posed a future danger to others, a factor considered during sentencing in Texas capital cases. This argument drew attention well beyond the courtroom. Several prominent musicians, including Travis Scott, Young Thug, T.I., and Killer Mike, publicly supported Broadnax's appeal on this specific point, arguing that treating rap lyrics as literal confessions or threats set a troubling precedent, one that could affect how creative expression is used as evidence in future cases, regardless of what people think of Broadnax individually. Legal analysts who reviewed the case for outside commentary noted that courts generally set an extremely high bar for introducing new evidence this late in a death penalty case, particularly evidence based on a co-defendant's own confession, which carries obvious credibility questions given that Cummings had every reason, at that stage, to try to help his cousin. At the same time, these analysts pointed out that the DNA evidence existed independently of Cummings' motives, which is what made this case more complicated than a simple last-minute claim. Not everyone connected to the case saw the confession as credible. Teresa Butler, Matthew's mother, was direct in her response, publicly describing Cummings' affidavit as a stall tactic and calling it a lie, arguing it was a last-minute attempt to delay an execution that had already been through nearly 2 decades of appeals. By the time this new evidence reached the courts, the central question of the case had shifted. It was no longer just about whether Broadnax deserved a death sentence. It was about whether Texas was prepared to seriously reconsider who had actually fired the shots, this close to an execution date, based on evidence that could have been raised, in theory, years earlier. That question would ultimately land in the hands of the courts, the state's Board of Pardons and Paroles, and finally, the U.S. Supreme Court. With an execution date set for April 30th, 2026, Broadnax's legal team moved quickly to get the new evidence in front of every level of the courts. On April 7th, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Cummings' confession would not be considered grounds to pause the execution. The court's reasoning centered on timing, suggesting that questions about who actually fired the shots should have surfaced years earlier, not weeks before a scheduled execution, and that Broadnax's own recorded confessions from 2008 still carried significant weight regardless of Cummings' later claims. The Texas Attorney General's office took an even firmer position in its filings, describing Cummings' confession as questionable new evidence and stating that Broadnax's related claims about racial bias during jury selection were entirely meritless. Shortly after, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied Broadnax's request for clemency. His legal team then made a direct appeal to Governor Greg Abbott, requesting a 30-day reprieve to allow time for the new evidence, including the DNA claims, to be independently reviewed. The governor did not grant it, and no public explanation was given beyond the standard denial. The final legal effort came down to the U.S. Supreme Court. Broadnax's attorneys presented two core arguments. First, that his cousin's confession, combined with the DNA evidence, created serious doubt about his conviction. And second, that his constitutional rights had been violated during jury selection, when prosecutors allegedly removed prospective black jurors from the pool based on race rather than their individual answers. On the day of the scheduled execution, the Supreme Court denied both requests. The application for a stay of execution was formally rejected as moot, meaning the court did not find sufficient legal grounds to intervene at this stage, this close to the scheduled time. The justices did not issue an extended opinion explaining their reasoning beyond the procedural denial. With that ruling, every available legal avenue had been exhausted. Nearly 2 decades of appeals, a co-defendant's last-minute confession, DNA evidence that contradicted the original theory of the shooting, and a renewed argument over jury selection, none of it was enough, in the eyes of the courts, to change the outcome. The execution would proceed as scheduled. On the afternoon of April 30th, 2026, before the execution took place, Broadnax released a brief statement through his legal team, thanking the people who had supported him throughout his case. He expressed gratitude for what he described as the love, prayers, and legal effort behind the years-long fight to have his conviction reconsidered, saying it hadn't gone unnoticed. That evening, James Broadnax was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. In his final statement inside the death chamber, he spoke directly to the victims' families, saying he had prayed for years that his actions hadn't caused them lasting pain, and that he hoped they had found some measure of peace. He maintained, as he had in his later years, that he believed the state had gotten his case wrong. He then addressed his wife directly, telling her that his promise to her still stood and asking her to keep believing and stay strong. Tiana Kresnicki was among those who witnessed the execution. According to reports from those present, she called out that she loved him as the process took effect and had to be helped from the viewing area afterward, visibly overcome. Outside the prison, the response to the execution reflected just how much public attention this case had drawn in its final weeks. More than 80,000 people had signed a petition calling for the execution to be halted, and more than 60 religious leaders had publicly urged clemency. Vigils were held in multiple Texas cities that evening, including Huntsville, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio, with supporters gathering to pray and, in some cases, protest the state's decision to proceed. Notably, Broadnax's execution wasn't the only one carried out that day. Roughly an hour earlier, Florida executed a separate inmate, James Ernest Hitchcock, in an unrelated case involving the killing of a family member decades earlier, a coincidence of timing rather than any connection between the two cases, but one that underscored just how active capital punishment remains in parts of the country, even as public debate around it continues. For Broadnax, the execution marked the end of a legal fight that had spanned almost his entire adult life, one that, in its final weeks, had shifted from a question of punishment to a question of whether the right person had ever been identified as the shooter in the first place. In the days following the execution, Broadnax's legal team and family released a statement describing him as someone who had grown significantly during his time on death row, a mentor, they said, to many of the people around him, and someone who had expressed real remorse for his role in Swan and Butler's deaths. Demarius Cummings remains incarcerated at the Caulfield unit, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His confession did not result in any change to his own case. James Broadnax became the 599th person executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982, and the third person executed in Texas that year alone. Whether Cummings' final confession was the truth coming out too late, or a last attempt to spare his cousin, is something that will likely never be fully settled. What isn't in question is that two young men, Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler, lost their lives that night over almost nothing at all, and that the legal system's final word came before every question surrounding this case had been answered. If you've made it this far, thank you genuinely for sticking with a case that doesn't offer easy conclusions. If you want more cases covered with this same level of depth, subscribing helps make that possible. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from.